And now it's my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, and that is Kyle Caldwell. In January of this year, Kyle joined the staff of the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation in Flint, Michigan as director of the Pathways Out of Poverty program. And as much as we value, and I really do value Kyle's perspective as a grant maker, we really asked him to be here with us today because of his previous role as president and CEO of the Michigan Nonprofit Association, which is a statewide membership association focused on serving nonprofits to advance their missions. And in that role, Kyle was instrumental in forging new and sustained ways that the nonprofit and philanthropic sector in Michigan partnered with state government in the executive, legislative, and regulatory levels. We know that Kyle will inspire us. Kyle is somebody that I've known for a very long time. We've tried to replicate and get the incredible work that he's been successful in developing in Michigan into Illinois. And I think you'll all be really impressed with some of these examples that he gives us and that he will hopefully inspire all of us to work toward. Kyle?
Well, good afternoon. Now that was just pathetic. Now, Don got a rousing good afternoon. So, I'm from Michigan, I'm the import. At least I should get a rousing good afternoon. So I'll give you one more shot at this. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Excellent, thanks so much. And thank you, Valerie, for this great opportunity to talk about a former job. This is great because I no accountability whatsoever about what I say here, and I can take total credit for everything, and no one can deny it because I don't work there anymore, so it's really great. And I also want to say that it's extremely daunting to follow someone who has honorable in his title. So the honorable governor, how do you live with something like that, right? So he's honorable no matter where he goes, and then if you get the right honorable title, you have to be correct in everything that you do and honorable. That's a daunting task to follow a guy like that. So I want to thank Valerie for doing that, and there's only one person I can think of that I would give that title who's not an elected official, and that is Valerie. I think that all of us owe her a great debt of gratitude for the great work that she's done for the last 40 years in the sector, and by the way, she started in preschool. And the work that she's done to advance not only a great partnership with both grant makers and grant seekers, but also the great partnership that she's developed throughout the country for policymakers to understand nonprofits and the great work that we do. And I'm really, really disappointed that she's going to retire in June, but she absolutely deserves it. Please join me in thanking her for all her great work. Don, did I get that right? I wrote it exactly like you wrote it here, so I got it right. So I'm here to talk to you a little bit about why you would do public-private partnerships and what's the importance and what are some of the models and lessons that we learned. And I just have to be really clear that the Michigan Nonprofit Association is essentially a sister organization to the Donors Forum. But we also have a regional association of grant makers called the Council of Michigan Foundations that's headed up by Rob Collier. So I just want to point out that unlike Illinois, where it took one woman to do the job right, it took two men in two different organizations in Michigan to try to do the same thing that you're doing here. And when Rob and I were trying to think about some of the challenges facing both grant makers and grant seekers, we realized that public policy was eating our lunch and that we had no voice in decision making that was going on. And that was a real problem, not just because of the consequences of public policy, but it was a real problem because once the policy was enacted, there was a lot of conversation about, well, this didn't work and that didn't work and why didn't these things work? Well, the reason was the customer wasn't in the room when the policy was developed. And that was as much as our fault as anyone else's for not putting ourselves in the room in an effective way. So we tried to figure out where are other places that we need to engage and what does that engagement look like? And we were really concerned with a number of issues. Number one, the needs are greater than any one sector could handle. It doesn't matter if it was government, it doesn't matter if it was a nonprofit sector, it doesn't matter if it was commerce. No one sector could address all the challenges that we were facing, and we needed to make sure those voices were in the room with policymakers. We also know that on average, and this holds true in Michigan, I bet it does in the great state of Illinois, that 30% of funding for nonprofits comes from public sources, whether it's the federal dollars, state dollars, or local. 30%, so a third of your customers are driving a great deal of the work in the sector. And having voice to that is really important. The third thing we were really worried about was that the independent sector, the nonprofit sector, really needs to be present in order for a thriving, healthy democracy to succeed. Because it brings a voice that is not normally in the public space. It really advocates for the vulnerable, and it holds for the transparency issues that we need to have front and center when we deal with really hard public policy issues. And then finally, we needed to have a voice when regulations are developed to ensure that policymakers really know the implications of regulations, tax policy, and other laws affecting not only the nonprofit sector, but those we serve. So we had those issues. We needed to think about how we engaged. And so we had three targets: our regulators, our legislators, and our governors. And we had to figure out what are the right vehicles for each one of those, because they're unique. As the governor will tell you, having one body that works with the legislature has to be radically different than the body that works with the governor or the body that works with the attorney general or secretary of state. And so we tried to think, what are the interventions to deal with the issues that I just listed with the populations that we know are really important in our state, the governor, the legislature, and our regulator. So we developed three vehicles. I'm going to talk about these vehicles very quickly. I'm going to give you a couple stories, and then I'm going to wrap up with what did we learn from all of this. So the first one was a great structure that I love to share because everybody told me it wouldn't work, you can't get it done, and you won't get it done in your lifetime. Now, why not go for something like that when someone tells you all those things, right? And that was to develop a nonprofit caucus. And the reason that this was difficult is that Michigan, for a number of years, if you've been looking at our election cycles, have been doing the pendulum swing of majorities and minorities. And that has created a very polarized, cantankerous environment where parties are not working together well in either house or even within houses, the House, the Senate and the House in our state. So getting a caucus together to talk about the nonprofit sector in the middle of all those cantankerous arguments was really difficult. So what we did was we developed an agenda. We said, if we had a caucus, these are the 10 things that we would need to get done, and the number one rule is appropriations was not going to be on the table. That we had strong subsector advocates for that. We didn't want to bring that. We were really worried about the broader sector. Number two, we said that no matter what we developed, if we can't do it in a bipartisan way, we'll dissolve the caucus. And number three, we said that it has to be led by, for, and with the legislators, that we would support it, but this has to be their body. It took us around a year to put it together. In our first iteration, we had 47, it has to be even, we had 46 members of the caucus. And by not any design on my part, we had 26 Republicans and 26 Democrats, and we had even split in House and Senate. And they came together and said, we would like to be engaged in helping the nonprofit sector. We gave them an easy agenda, and we worked through some simple things like removing barriers to young people serving and volunteering by changing the laws for work permits. In Michigan, you had to get a work permit to volunteer, not just to get a job. Issues like that, just to sort of warm it up. Then we came into the second iteration of the nonprofit caucus, and lo and behold, we get right to work slapped right on the table. And I am fortunate that I was able to convene our caucus on the day of the right to work vote. Now, if you were following that in Michigan, you know that this was done at the end of the session. It was done very quickly, and there was tremendous protests. They shut down the Capitol. They arrested people in the rotunda. They closed the lawn. They kicked people out for 2-block radius. It was a cantankerous environment. The caucus leadership came into the room, and they came into the room fighting. And they were talking about how right to work was splitting. It was doing things that we didn't want to see. Unions were strong-arming members of the legislature. It was ugly, absolutely ugly. And I'm sitting there going, my caucus is gone. I've lost it. I'll never get them back. 10 minutes in the conversation, they all looked up, and they looked up at each other and said, that's not why we're here. We're here about the nonprofit sector, and we have a job to do. And this is Switzerland, as far as this is concerned. And they immediately turned it all off and got to work and finished the agenda that they had developed. So if you can do a nonprofit caucus in the middle of something as cantankerous as right to work, you can do it almost anywhere. But it has to be about the principles and the agenda that you set up. And we were proud to be able to facilitate the caucus and get a lot of work done in a very ugly environment. The second area that we wanted to really engage in was dealing with our regulator, the Attorney General. And so we had a long time had a conversation with the Attorney Generals, 2 Attorneys Generals, talking about how could we sit down together with you and talk about regulation before it's developed and implemented. How can we go after bad actors of our own, not having you run a headline that said you found a fraudulent charity. And there was some warm feelings about it. Yeah, great, and we sit down. Finally, we got one governor to set it up, and another governor convened it for the first time, and chose our first meeting to be the time that he announced that he was going after a certain international foundation and going to have them bring their money back to Michigan because they had moved to New York, and they hadn't spent a dime in the state of Michigan in 20 years. Now, just remember, Michigan has the Kellogg Foundation, we have the Kresge Foundation, we have my alma mater, the Mott Foundation, all concerned about donor intent, and a regulator going after your corpus and saying, you will now direct it back over here and I'm going to sue you. That was our first meeting of the Charitable Trust. So you can imagine that was kind of an eerie environment, but it was the greatest thing that could have happened because everybody showed up for the meeting. The Attorney General laid it on the table on what he wanted, and we brokered the conversation so that the Attorney General would drop the suit and the so far unnamed foundation would bring back original donor intent and look at investments in Michigan. Now, someone might call that blackmail, someone might call that just good stewardship. In either way, the table that we set was where the conversation took place and the problems got solved. That council exists today, and it still goes on. It's gone now through 3 attorneys general, and endures because we are the neutral table that can bring the sector together. The third vehicle that I wanted to talk about is dealing with the executive branch. Through 4 different governors that I've served on, we've seen this interesting phenomenon where heads of state agencies now go to philanthropy and say, I've got this great idea, and if you just give me $5 million, I can match this federal dollars, and we can bring this program to Michigan. And then you turn, and then there's another agency head from the state who said, yeah, I want to do that program too. I'm here for the same solicitation. Geez, I'm sorry. We've got 2 asks in the lobby of the same foundation for the same thing, and we didn't coordinate together. So foundations were being inundated with these different asks from different agencies, all about opportunities to partner with the state. So we created the Office on Foundation Liaison, and it had 2 jobs. The first job was to find out from the executive branch, what's your agenda? What do you need from the foundation and nonprofit community to enable a better state? Give us that specific agenda. And then what we're going to do is in the Office on Foundation Liaison, we're going to go out to the foundation community and say, where is there a match? And how do we come together to develop a common agenda? 2 things that came out of that. First, we were one of the states that was just unable to engage in applications for Race to the Top, in part because we went from a 3,500 Michigan Department of Education employee agency down to 350 in less than 5 years. Think about that, 3,500 down to 350 in less than 5 years. So the capacity to really go after race to the top dollars had been diminished. So a number of foundations were concerned about that. They brought in consultants that helped put the application together. We were not successful in achieving the grant, but what we were able to do is many of the reforms that needed to be done in Michigan that everybody agreed to, but nobody could get it done. So that initiative, again, funded by facilitated by funding from the foundation community, brought that to fruition, but it also helped the state in a very meaningful way. Another one was that we were concerned about early start, pre-K, early education. And there were a lot of dollars left on the table. There was a lot of opportunity, but nobody could put together the focal point on how do you bring early childhood as a universal opportunity for children in Michigan. So the Office on Foundation Liaison worked with a number of foundations, and we started the Office of Great Start. Put someone in charge for putting together a common agenda for all funders, but also departments of ed on early childhood education. The governor just signed last year the first ever universal early childhood funding for Michigan. A lot of that was led by foundations who then came in and not only helped facilitate the process, but also were able to incubate little starters of different models, both through Head Start and outside of Head Start, that could be replicated in other communities to use those dollars to better serve children in early childhood needs. So that gives you three vehicles working with the legislative branch, our regulator, and the executive branch, and a few models on how that interaction can be beneficial. So what did we learn? Number one, that engagement is necessary, not just nice. We cannot continue to go through this idea that somehow if they hear my story, if they see my people that I serve, that should be enough. It's not enough to tell your story. You have to engage, you have to find vehicles to be in the mix as decisions are being made, because advocacy is great, but engagement is the new coin of the realm. Number two, sharing assets, data, and needs can lead to more effective, efficient, and I think enduring outcomes when we look at both public policy and the work of philanthropy and the nonprofit sector. Some of the examples that I gave earlier were not only great because the vehicle and partnerships were there, but because the investment of the foundation community, there was data sources that could be used in developing policy that just weren't available before because the think tanks weren't brought in. Foundations can do that. They can leverage what they know as well as what they spend to be helpful to policymaking. Three, you have to build places of trust to develop collaboration. And what was interesting about this is that just because we set the table, it doesn't mean people were going to come. We had to build an environment where the issue on the table was what we focused on, and politics had to stay at the doorway. Easier said than done, and it takes work. But once you get players all focused on the issue, the other stuff can be a distraction, absolutely, but it doesn't have to be brought into the room so long as you have clear rules of engagement. So I think there's a couple opportunities based on what we know, based on what we learn, and based on our experience that I think can be informative to what Illinois considers. First, any opportunity to host the broad, neutral, open table where issues can be identified, explored, and addressed, take advantage of it. Sometimes it is really difficult because, as I imagine, for funders especially, you don't want to host a table and build the expectation that you may fund what comes out of the discussion. You got to be clear about that up front. But just the hosting of the dialogue is so powerful, it can lead to other engagement opportunities. Second, the idea that once you convene, if you can identify, test, and prove promising practices that other sectors can scale, they can be brought to that table as possible solutions. I want to give one caution here. Valerie says it better than I do, but I have fun telling the same story, which is if you took Michigan, like Illinois, has a very strong philanthropic community. Some of the largest foundations in the world rest in our borders. If you were to take their payout and their corpus, that means every nickel they own, put it in a pot, and I'm including community foundations, private donors, major foundations, all of them. If you're in Michigan, put your money in the pot. Take it out of the bank, take it out of the market, put it in the pot. and you handed it over to the Michigan legislature and governor and said, God bless, go forth. 96 days and it's all gone. 96 days. So you cannot expect to test and to drive examples from government and have philanthropy scale. It cannot happen. So you have to think really creatively about what you can do and what you can't do and build the right set of expectations. Lastly, I think informing lawmakers on the implications of policy, especially right now, tax policy, as we look at tax reform at the federal level, but looking at charitable environment and policy at the local level is really important, because those are the tools that we use in philanthropy and in the nonprofit sector to partner. And if your tools are removed, you're not a strong partner. So being informed about policy decisions, especially tax policy, is really important for lawmakers to understand. So just a couple closing thoughts on why this is really important. And for this, I'll fall on my own sword. Right now, Michigan is not unlike Illinois, dealing with some pretty hard issues, especially as we look at the state budget. But right now, we are fortunate to be in the headlines. Time Magazine twice a year, and now on the Wall Street Journal for the largest single municipal bankruptcy in the country. So, what do you do with something like that? Well, first off, you look very closely about not only what's happening, but what's going to happen after restructuring. So first off, what's happening? And this is very much related to this conversation. Right now, we have one of our largest cultural assets on the auction block table, potentially, the Detroit Institute of Arts. The reason it's on the table is that we developed a public-private partnership 20 years ago that said the city cannot afford to run a museum. Let us privatize and partner so that we can continue this important tourist hub and not have to shut it down. But now, those collections are likely to be thrown into the mix for auction to pay down the pensioners and creditors that are part of the Detroit Chapter 9 bankruptcy. That's a big problem. It's a big problem in part because that's what we need to recover. We need places like this so that we can bring tourists in and recover. So, and it's also a nonprofit asset. So as I stand here today in the Cultural Center, down the street from the Art Institute, in the center of Chicago, who has been, by the way, listed as number 2 or number 3 as likely to be the next Detroit, I would be having very serious conversations with policymakers to say, how do we make sure we avoid what Detroit's going through right now? How do we make sure that we have the right partnerships that allow all of us to move forward in a productive way that doesn't take charitable assets and now convert them into private assets? The last one that I'll mention is engagement doesn't have to be always with policymakers. It can be with vulnerable populations and policy at the same time. My example of this is that Michigan was really concerned in the last census that we were at a population tipping point. By the way, only state in the country that lost population. Now, some people are stagnant, some people grow at a low rate, only state that lost population in 10 years. We knew that was coming, but we also knew that if we didn't get everybody out into the census, we were going to lose a seat or 3 in the House, and we were going to lose a lot of money. So the nonprofit sector worked with the Census Bureau to make sure we had a right count, that everybody was counted. And we were able to demonstrate that well over 1 million to 500,000 people who didn't get counted in the last census got counted in this census. And we really worked hard to make sure our homeless population was counted, our immigrant population was counted, and all those who normally would, vulnerable populations who don't trust a census worker but would trust a nonprofit to help them be counted in the census were at hand. There are a million different examples like that where nonprofits can help engage with policymakers to make partnerships work. So all of this to say that we have to not only survive, but we have to thrive in this environment of collaboration. And strangely enough, the closest phrase that comes to mind to illustrate this comes from Charles Darwin. Now you think of Darwin, you think of survival of the fittest, and only the strong survive. But if you read his work a little bit deeper, actually his work was about synergy and balance and ecosystems and collaboration. So one of his quotes that I like to think about when I talk about collaboration is this one. And he says that it's a long history of mankind and animal. That those who have learned to collaborate and improvise are most effectively able to prevail. In other words, if you're symbiotic, you're going to make it. If you think that independence is the only way, you're not going to make it. I can think of no better way to think about the work going forward with the Donors Forum and this great agenda and this great summit than to think about how do we collaborate, how do we improvise in order for all of us to thrive through the sector. Thank you for this great opportunity and good luck today. Thank you.
Now you see why we invited Kyle here. Just amazing, amazing examples, inspiration, wisdom in what you said. There is so much to chew on and to think about, Kyle. Thank you so much. I suspect you're like me. I'm sort of dying to ask Kyle questions, but we have to wait a little longer. But you will have an opportunity after our next segment to do that. So start thinking about that. But Kyle, once again, thank you so much for the experience. You made it sound so easy, and I know it wasn't. I'm grateful for knowing that it wasn't, because that means that we can get there too, and we need to get there. So thanks so much.